This is the state of the nation. Ibifa Uganda. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The state of the nation with Henry SSALI. The state of the nation with Henry SSALI. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Henry SSALI. Before we start, as always, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto African Alumni Association operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land for the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Henry SSALI, and this is the state of the nation. I want to thank each and every one of you who is following us, and encourage you to subscribe on our YouTube channel at Henry SSALI. This is the state of the nation. Today, the discussion is going to revolve around the new Afghanistan Order, or the new Afghan Order, whichever you want to call it, where a new government has been ushered in by the waves of change. So most of you probably already know what is happening in Kabul or in Afghanistan. If you don't, you might get a snippet of what is going on by listening to this conversation today. I want to make a disclaimer that we are not experts on this subject, but we are just going to have a discussion, try to assess some of the notions that have been set aside as this conversation continues to evolve. Of course, it's a developing conversation. We may, if time allows, also try to talk about other issues, but for now, many of you know that Afghanistan is commonly referred to as the graveyard of the empires. Last week, the political winds of change ushered in the Taliban government to create the new Afghanistan Order. While the fall of Kabul is closely attributed to America's unsuccessful foreign policy for overseas nation building, the paradox of their failure is that the US is evidently still the foremost superpower that influences political behavior in the global south, specifically in Uganda. So last week when Kabul fell to the Taliban, one of the first countries to declare our intentions to take on refugees or people who do not believe in the Taliban government was Uganda. And of course, it has pledged to take on up to 2,000, perhaps more. We shall see. 2,000 refugees, Afghan refugees. So what is our purpose today as the state of the nation? So the state of the nation, of course, you know some of my regular participants, including Mitala Muzukuru Mswangali and Dr. Stella Nyanzi. We are going to have a conversation surrounding some of the questions that have arisen since the events in Afghanistan, and of course the subsequent pledge by the Ugandan government to accommodate 2,000 Afghan refugees. So for example, who decides which kinds of refugees will be welcomed to Uganda? our legislators have a say in this conversation? Who sits on that table that decides that yes, we are ready, we should welcome refugees to Uganda? To what extent is Uganda capable of welcoming refugees? What kind of livelihoods are they going to offer uh, these incoming refugees? Given the pandemic circumstances, the COVID circumstances, are these refugees immunized? How are they going to interact with the people uh, in Uganda, wherever they are going to live? We have no answers, but we are going to try to contemplate and have discussions regarding these conversations and see how far we can take it. Perhaps you can join us and pitch in and hopefully have a productive conversation as we proceed. But to begin, I'm going to invite my friend, Mr. Mitala Muzukuru wa Mswangali, to introduce himself. Muzukuru wa Mswangali, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you very much, Henry. It's a pleasure. It's a beautiful pleasure. I'm coming to you live, guys, from here in the United Kingdom, the UK, or you can call it Upper Kampala, as some people prefer to call it. But it's a pleasure, Henry, to be here. As usual, as Henry did mention in the disclaimer, that we are not the experts on these subjects, but we are only here, to add our perspectives among, the crowd of perspectives that exist out there on a number of, topical and current issues, namely like the one which is currently trending, for quite some time now, since the fall of Afghanistan or Kabul, which is a very, very kind of interesting issue. By way of introduction, Julius Mitala is my name. I prefer to go by my screen name, Mitala Muzukuru wa Mswangali, which is a recognition of my grandfather, the man who made me who I am. I am a Ugandan. I've been living away from Uganda for quite a number of years now, but I'm passionately, interested in all the things that take place back home, because at heart, by description, by blood, and in every sense, I am a typical Ugandan born and bred child. So everything that happens, in motherland is something that is always of particular interest to me. And this is why I join, my esteemed colleagues here to be able to have this kind of conversations, with the rest of you. So looking forward to another, great interaction, and let's see how the conversation flows.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Muzukuru wa Mswangali, for those deliberations, your introduction. It's good that you always keep remind people that you are Muzukuru wa Mswangali. Just like I'm a Muzukuru wa Mugema, but I don't always declare it, but probably I should start declaring it. So as you know, of course, Kabul fell to the Taliban government last Monday. On Tuesday, Uganda, of course, declared that, or at least to the extent that we know, the Uganda government offered to take on 2,000 Afghanistan refugees, and of course, they said that refugees would be starting coming in. I am not sure if they have started coming in already. I do have a couple of clips that indicate, some indicate that they haven't yet started coming in. But if they have, uh, of course, we still have to continue having this conversation and see where and how this issue or this of course, this issue is going to be handled. It's going to be handled. So, I have a video by BBC, actually, interviewing Mr. J.J. Odong. Let us watch this and start the conversation that way.
Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. We begin in Afghanistan, which has seen days of upheaval following the withdrawal of international forces. The advance of the Taliban has prompted tens of thousands of people to flee as the country faces an uncertain future. On yesterday's program, we covered which Western countries formerly embroiled in the conflict are now allowing in Afghan refugees. But what about the African continent? Well, Uganda was the first country there to signal a willingness to take in refugees. But that was earlier in the week, and no concrete plans are yet in place, and still no refugees have arrived. Well, I'm now joined by General J.J. Odongo, Uganda's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thanks a lot for talking to us here on Focus on Africa, General. When do you expect these 2,000 refugees in Uganda, in your country?
Thank you, Peter. The subject of these individuals, I would rather not call them refugees, is still a matter of discussion between ourselves and our partners and friends from the government of the United States.
What's exactly is holding it up?
Well, it is not anything special, but you know, for persons of this nature to come from that distance into a country like Uganda, they just don't walk in like cows. There must be processes, there must be programs put in place for them to be received.
And what are these protocols that you're putting in place? What are these plans that you're putting in place for them?
For example, where are we going to put them? Do you remember now we are going through the COVID pandemic? We've got to make sure that by the time they arrive, we will be able to test them, we will be able to confirm if they're vaccinated, we will be able to isolate if any of them carry the virus, and things of that nature.
Indeed, when I first heard this story earlier in the week, one question that came to my mind is, why is Uganda taking them in?
No, you must remember that we did not wake up from nowhere to do that. We were approached by our friends and partners who indicated that there might be need to remove people from Afghanistan, and would we be willing to accept them? And considering our record in receiving and looking after refugees, we did not find any difficulty in saying we would be willing to do so.
And I'll come to that record of you hosting other refugees in a moment. But have you decided what caliber of Afghans you're going to take in? I mean, are they going to be ex-government workers, ex-politicians? Is it women and children? Who exactly will you be taking in?
Our discussions are exactly on that point. But what we have now got the indication about is that it's going to be a variety of people, contractors who are working with the Americans, interpreters who are working with the Americans, officials who are working with the Americans, with their families. Therefore, wives and children are expected to be involved in this group, which is expected to arrive.
We've been trying to gauge the pulse of Ugandans on this issue, and some people in your country, as you mentioned yourself, said, listen, we already have too many refugees within our territory. Others are saying Afghans wouldn't have taken us in if the roles were reversed. And there are yet people who are saying, this is not our problem. Why are we getting involved?
Peter, I want you to remember one thing. We Ugandans, many of us have been refugees before. We know the pain and suffering that refugees go through. We Ugandans, particularly we, the NRM, who are now in charge, have all along taken it into consideration that our responsibility to the international community and our responsibility to our fellow human beings is to provide them sanctuary when they require it.
Okay, General J.J. Odongo, thank you very much for your time here on Focus on Africa. We do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter.
All All right. You heard what he has said. A couple of few questions that he asks himself. I think we have posed already. Where, for example, for instance, where are they going to live? But he also talks a lot. I think he also mentions that they're not just going to walk in like cows, which is very interesting. I think that takes us back to the question of who decides that, of course, refugees should come into the country. But he also mentions the notion that many of us have been refugees before, so we do just uh, to the to some extent uh, we should be comfortable. Ugandans should be comfortable allowing in more refugees from wherever. When he says we, he does not exactly describe or define who is included in the we. So is it the legislators? Is it just the NRM? Or is it just the top executive? Does everyone in the executive know? Was everyone within the executive party to allowing this conversation, to allowing these refugees to come in, specifically to come in at a very short notice? What I see that is very pertinent right now in this conversation is that even though the US, throughout this conversation, the US has been regarded as one that has failed in Afghanistan nation building, it shows that America or the US is still very powerful because they just made a phone call to Uganda and told them, are you going to take in refugees from Afghanistan? We do not know how many refugees are going to be taken in the US. We haven't investigated that yet. But it's very interesting that during the same conversation where most analysts in the US, at least right-wing analysts, were saying that the US had failed on its duty to build Afghanistan for over 2 decades now. That just a phone call to the Ugandan government or establishment, a yes was given in this regard without even knowing where they are going to live, if they are vaccinated, and which kind of refugees. Are they going to accept expatriates, people who are working with contractors who are working with the US government in Afghanistan? Are they going to accept all kinds of refugees or all kinds of people, for that matter, who would like to leave the new Afghanistan order to seek for better refuge elsewhere? These are all important questions to engage with. I wonder what your thoughts are, Mr. Muswangali. But before you start, I think Dr. Stella is with us. Dr. Stella, we have started. Welcome to the State of the Nation. How is your weekend?
Right. Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to participate again. I'm from Iceland, in Munich, going somewhere else. But for this weekend, I'm delighted to be part of the State of the Nation address. Mitala muzukulu wa Muswangali onyiridde nnyo ssebo nkulamusizza nkutumidde ab'e Toronto muli mutya. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this conversation because, like, when I joined, you were referring to those of us who have been refugees. There are all sorts of Ugandans in diaspora who come in different categories. Most of you are not refugees, although the general impression is, they are all asylum seekers, they are all refugees. But for those of us who have been registered as refugees, or the children of refugees, or those of us who have studied what it means to be a refugee in another country, this is an a wonderful opportunity for me to participate in this conversation, not so much as an expert on Afghani issues or an expert on the politics of relocating people facing a crisis, but more as a child who was a refugee, part of a refugee family that fled from Uganda during the immediate Amin Dada times, but also as a person who has fled from Yoweri Museveni the first time. I experienced exile and I applied for asylum, and I had to leave my country of asylum seeking because the system does not work. Nobody had prepared me. Nobody had told me what happens to women with children and the processing moment, that there are no facilities to cater for a woman with 3 teenagers, okay, who need school, who need extra access to telephones and communication when telephones and communication become points of risk. I have 3 teenagers who are not at risk from the government. Why is their communication taken away? Some of them have sweethearts. One of them had online classes, but all of us had to live under conditions of surveillance where communication was taken away from us because of fears of being tracked, etc., etc. And I know I'm supposed to just introduce myself to the people who are viewing, but I want to assert my role in this panel on the basis of a woman who has been exiled, and when the processes were no longer bearable for my children and myself, I went back to my country of danger. And because in Afghanistan, part of the category of people who are most at risk are women who refuse to bow down to Sharia, women who may be Muslim but do not practice the entirety of restrictions that the jihadists called Talibans demand of them. And the perspective of those women may never be taken, but also the lessons of a Black African woman fleeing from her country and arriving at a reception center, living in a protection house, living in circumstances where there was no preparation done for a woman with 3 teenagers. We were put in a concrete house and there were restrictions about food, but one of my children does not eat boiled tomatoes and he needs a different sort of tomatoes. And I had to go out every day to buy tomatoes. But because of our conditions, the conditions of our asylum, we were not allowed on the streets. And when I broke that rule to go and look for food for my children, like fresh dodo and fresh, buy fresh foodstuffs from the mama mboga, I became a protection risk. How am I a protection risk when I'm getting food for my children? Food you haven't provided, right? We were given fridges and wonderful amenities, but the real basics of a woman needs a particular type of sanitary pads. One of my housemates that I was with does not do always these cheap sanitary products. She needs cotton. So tengi would be an option, but then there's cotton products on the market that we know where to get as women. And I had to go and look for these supermarkets that provide to women. But I became a security risk. I was hazardous to our protection. But how does protection work for women for whom a relocation program has not thought through? The people who think for resettlement think through relocating people, a man thinking for other men. Rarely do they invite women to participate in these plans and programs. And so women who have children, women who are pregnant, women who have specific gender needs end up in an asylum shelter without the most basic considerations for their needs. And so it's a delight for me to enter this conversation with 2 men. I thought even if I'm from a different class, I was talking about protest literature in prison with a class for my friend Danson Kahiana, who's teaching literature students in Uganda. So I apologize for being late. I'm delighted to be here. I should stop my introduction and let the discussion flow. Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. Of course, you have actually given us context in which to base our conversation. So I wonder what Mr. Doctor, you should probably start preparing to become a doctor yourself.
You are giving away so much information, Henry, but but we will come to that in different times.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Dr. Stella Nyanzi. I've described Dr. Stella Nyanzi in one of my posts elsewhere in some of the platforms that I interact with. I have described, and Henry, I think you've seen it, I have described her as Uganda's most celebrated professor and most visible professor, actually. And I think for me, Stella inspires me. I must confess that she's an inspiration of some sort. I love following what she does. I love the literature that she puts out. It's nice for the world to educate themselves on issues that are really critical like that. And I think one of the problems that people tend to find with Stella is because they tend to engage with her when they have not rehearsed or they don't understand, her background and where she's coming from and the nature of conversation she brings on the table. So welcome back, Stella. You are an incredible part of this panel. We would want you to commit publicly that this is where you belong, whatever the circumstances, that you will be with us. It's a marriage of some sort.
I am married to this panel, sir.
Right. But to go into the debate today, and I'm sorry, Henry, I might speak a bit longer because this is quite a very serious matter, also a very serious issue. I've heard the Right Honourable Minister there in the introduction clip, not being very categorically clear on distinction between refugees and other groups of people, and I think that's a pitfall that many people tend to fall into, failure to contextualize those two separate groups of people, immigrants and refugees. There's a clear distinction. A refugee is a refugee, somebody who is fleeing conflict. They are running away, their life is under threat, and there is various international conventions and legislations that regulate the way in which refugees should be handled. So that's a very critical issue. On the other hand, immigrants, it's you move on your own volition. You make a decision because you want to go elsewhere, and create a different kind of lifestyle. I mean, the young man, the sportsman who recently was in trouble in Kampala could not be, classified as a refugee. Well, I don't know what his circumstances were when he reached in Japan, but technically he wouldn't be, described as a refugee, except if his story had changed and he was saying something different. But I think the clearest distinction you can make at that point is that he was possibly somebody, like Stella's hinted. Many other people live in countries outside the places where they were born out of their own volition because they have migrated either for work or for whatever reason to go and seek, greener pastures, that is being called. And there's always that conflation because people always confuse those matters. They apply all sorts of derogatory kind of terms, and discussions are not always very clearly understood. So it can be kind of a messy kind of situation. But I just wanted to make that because I felt the minister did not, make that introduction very clear. And it is important that that distinction is clearly made. Because when you look at what's happened in Afghanistan, the people, I mean, you need to look at the screens. You need to look at the news that's coming from there. It's horrendous. It's heartbreaking, I mean, that force, that invisible force that gets a man or a woman in whatever circumstances to hold tight onto a moving, airplane, literally fleeing for their lives. It must be a force, that is beyond imagination. I just want one of us or any one of us who's watching us tonight, to put yourselves in that situation where you have to make that decision between life and death, between fleeing and staying at home. I think people who leave their home countries, they don't leave their home countries because they want to leave, really, especially in a situation that you find the Afghanistan people in. People don't leave their countries. They don't make those decisions because they want to leave. There is something they are running away from. And whatever they are running away from, it must be a real threat. So it's really horrendous. And I think some of the videos we've already seen coming there, and I don't know how authentic they can be, but we've seen, some of these horrible people who don't have any kind of regard for human life or human decency, rounding up people, shooting them, hunting down people, and the crime they have committed is simply because they have, carried out work with another, state organ or whatever, their work is now become, the point of threat for them, for their lives. And it's really sad, it's really sad to watch. But I want to look at, Uganda's record as a host country for refugees. And I must acknowledge that I think Uganda's record has been praised, but this is not a new thing. It's not a new thing. I think if anybody cares, to do some kind of research, since I think the earliest indication we can get refugees arriving in Uganda was, I think, immediately after this, or before, after the First World War, when Uganda hosted around 7,000 Polish refugees. Britain brought into Uganda around 7,000. I mean, I grew up in Uganda. I don't necessarily remember seeing people of Polish background. I don't know what could have happened, to that sort of people, whether they were resettled in another area, whether they went away. But Uganda has been on record, since those times, So what we are seeing here, the Museveni government shouldn't really be taking credit for this. This is part and parcel of Uganda's political history, Even before, in pre-independence Uganda, from the 1962 through the 1970s, through the 1980s, Uganda has been hosting refugees from Somalia, from Sudan, from the Congo, from everywhere. And Uganda, actually, it's been praised. Even during the times of Idi Amin, even during the times of Milton Obote, Uganda was always praised as having a very, liberal refugee policy compared, to other nations. One of the countries of comparison has been cited as Kenya, because I think Stella is the authority on this. She's been in Kenya, she can testify. But Uganda has a better kind of liberal policy towards refugees, generally speaking. They allow refugees greater freedom of movement, greater freedom of integration, greater freedom of work. You've seen there's a prominent Somali, refugee woman or former refugee woman who was granted refugee, was granted asylum in Uganda. She's gone on to become one of the most prominent business, persons in the country. That's the kind of record that Uganda has, and I think this is not. It's not a gesture that's coming from the government necessarily. I think Uganda as a people, Ugandans as a people, we tend to be calm. We tend to be very accommodative. We tend to be very welcoming. For those of us who grew up in those kind of extended, huge families, the kind of sorts of things that we were accustomed to as young children. I was raised by my grandparents, and I remember we had refugees, even internal refugees. People used to come at our place. They could sit with us and we would eat together, As children, we would sit on the Lusania, consume food, courtesy of my grandmother. And these are people we didn't have anything in any relation with. Some of these people were from Rwanda, They became very close people with us, and we refer to them as brothers. So this is something, it's in the blood, it's in the historical background, or a political historical background of Uganda as a nation, to be, a country that welcomes refugees, and we tend to give them, that kind of space to be able to flourish, which is not kind of reciprocated possibly in other neighboring countries. And I think the United Nations Human Rights Refugee, Council, UNHRC, has clearly stated that Uganda's liberal model of self-reliance in terms of refugee, the Uganda's refugee policy, is a policy that deserves to be emulated by other countries as a model for the development of the various refugee policies. So that's the context in which we are. But having said that, wherever refugees or people from a different country, arrive in another country, it always creates that anxiety. It creates conflict within the host communities. Even in our own communities in Uganda, these kind of issues have been there. People feel like maybe the numbers that are coming in are maybe too much for them, for the country to be able to absorb, and so on and so forth. People have been worried about land, being taken away from them. And again, I'm sorry, this issue of land comes back into the arena. But these are some of the things that people always think about, land being grabbed from host communities to cater for refugee communities, And I'm very sensitive to that because, as I said, it's got to be something that's really forceful, that makes you, be engraped in that kind of fear to want to run away from a country of your birth, for fear of your life. So that is the context in which we are approaching this thing. But I want the policy makers, I want the government of Uganda to be very honest. They necessarily shouldn't take this as the problem we've had is that the entire political history of Uganda has a big chunk of it has been kind of wiped out. We tend to look at Uganda as though Uganda started in 1986. And I think for me that's a problem, because we are narrowing the lenses within which we are looking at things. But if you look back, and if you're a good researcher and you look back well into this sort of thing, these issues are well documented. So the numbers that we are talking about here, 2,000, is kind of modest compared to the number of refugees we've had in the country, from Rwanda, from Zaire, from Sudan, from Somalia, from so many other places. 2,000 is really a modest number. So that for me, that is really the context in which I approach this matter, and we can expound further on that as we look further into this conflict, how it has evolved, and what it actually does it mean, for Uganda as a nation committing itself, to take in those 2,000 or so, people. And I think I really want us to explore the questions that you are putting here. Who really decides? Who gets to decide? Who comes in? Who gets what? Where do they go? And so on and so forth. So those for me are the issues that I will be concentrating on in this discussion. You on mute, Henry.
Thank you so much, Mitala Muzukulu wa Mswanga. I realized I was on mute because my computer was telling me, "Hey, they don't hear you." I think you have done a great job expanding the horizon of this conversation, and I think as we continue engaging, it's reasonable that think about the history, but it's also important that we examine these primary questions that you listed when you are concluding the conversation. But I think we also we must not exclude the US influence in this decision as we engage in this conversation, because I think they were key. The US is key to how, despite Uganda's generosity and welcomingness, if that's a word, I'm not sure if it's a word. I think it's important that we interrogate how that decision came about, and how and who is going to be implicated in this conversation. Dr. Stella, I wonder how, if you have any response to Mr. Mswangali's submission there, before I play any other video that I think might continue to give us context of this conversation.
Right. So just very quickly to say that in terms of the categories of refugees, that one might be fleeing from political persecution. One could be fleeing because of persecution on grounds of their race. And so we had refugees taken in from South Africa during apartheid times.
Right.
And the issue was racial, not so much the politics. We have had economic refugees in Uganda when dictator Idi Amin woke up one day and got a vision, and he expelled a number of Ugandans of Asian origin who were maybe second generation citizens of Uganda, and they went to Britain, among other countries, as economic refugees. Their businesses were taken away from them. They were not able to get jobs or shops or anything. When they packed, many of them left their assets behind. And so in terms of taking care and resettling economic refugees, the sort of package one has to give is different, because they are economic people, traders, investors, etc., etc., who don't have any wealth to rely on because it's been left in the country of persecution, the country of origin. And why I'm introducing this is because, for example, the other categories are people who are persecuted because of gender. And so I have been a witness, an expert witness for a number of women in the Gambia who are fleeing from the Gambia because they refuse to subject their daughters to female genital circumcision. Now, this is not about politics or anything. It's about the culture that a woman may feel is doing things to children before 18 years, and while the woman might have undergone it, she's protecting her minor children. And so in terms of thinking about the categories of refugees, I want to say kind of slightly depart from Muzukuluwa, Muswangali, and say that sometimes there are economic refugees, but an economic refugee is not a person who thinks, Kampala, life is very difficult, I can't get a job, and they see that Cheyo in London seems to be easy, so they run to the UK and think they can claim to be economic refugees. An economic refugee is a person such as myself who has a job and a PhD and cannot work in a university with her qualifications, not because of anything, but because the government won't allow me. And so when someone takes me to their country, they must be able to allow me to compete fairly on the job market with my PhD. They open up the possibilities for me as a professional refugee. And so, and the last category are homosexual men and women from Uganda who go to countries such as Kenya, and still in Kakuma refugee camp, the LGBTIQ people there are facing homophobic persecution. So it's not political. It could be political because our country, Uganda, is homophobic. But so there's a whole array of refugees. And I want to say that in terms of processing a refugee, one must know the sort of country they are relocating to. What processes have been undertaken to classify the causes of fleeing from Afghanistan? We don't know who is coming. Are they economic refugees? Are they Islamic refugees? Are they gender? What are the grounds for their claims for persecution? And I think this question is important because we know, at the risk of sounding like an Islamophobe, but I am not, we know that the current political temperature in Afghanistan is one where they are radical jihadists, right? And I don't see any assessment of separating the radicals from everyday Afghanis or Afghanistan people who really need protection. And my question is serious because I have friends who lost limbs because of jihad terrorism in Kampala. I don't know if you remember the rugby, people threw a bomb in Kampala. And I ask this seriously because I know that when we bring in refugees, we are not assessing them and classifying them and profiling them. And I'm not saying that every Muslim is problematic. But for me, as a person who buried but also treated young men who are watching rugby and their legs got cut off by bombs, and up to today, they are still disabled because of the terrorist attacks, I am very concerned about the sort of akakumuta kebakozesa. What's the word for kakumuta? The sieve that is being used to classify for us what sorts of people we are bringing into Uganda. If we don't know, we shall then have a woman with teenagers put in a house with one bathroom. I have never bathed with my boys in the same bathroom. Maybe it's a class problem, but I had a big problem sharing a toilet with boys who don't put the toilet seat down. And that was the beginning of my crisis with the sort of facilities that were given to me. Yet men without children had houses with 3 bathrooms, So in terms of preparation, we need to profile the people who are coming in. not to discriminate them, not to segregate them, but to prepare the facilities and also to protect the receiving communities, okay? Because we have seen gun-wielding Talibans. And for me, they look exactly like the innocent fleeing, some of them, right? How do we know? Sagala Kusosola, I'm not trying to discriminate or to negatively segregate, but I think that it's important for us, while opening our boundaries, to also do it cautiously and know. And so the question about who is coming is important. And I think not just who, but what are the grounds for their fleeing, for their seeking refuge in Uganda. And that brings me to the second. Henry cut me off when I'm going on and on and on. But that brings me to my second response to Muzukuluwa Muswangali's submission, where he talked about the 7,000 Polish refugees. So I've done research in Chaka 2, a refugee settlement, in Nachivale, in Oruchinga, in Rhino Camp, and I've worked with urban refugees. I was trying to understand the sexual and reproductive health needs of young girls in young refugee girls in Uganda. Because our record has been praised a lot, I wanted to know, what are they providing for these young refugee girls? Because I don't see provisions for young Ugandan girls, right? And, you know, charity begins at home. We can't be charitable to young refugee women if you're not charitable to Ugandan girls and women. And so I went to these refugee settlements. The Polish refugees, I think, were initially settled in Nachivale 1. Now I visited Nachivale 2. Part of the problem we have is that when refugees are received by OPM or Office of the Prime Minister through the UNHCR, all of them are mandatorily put in a reception center as their refugee status determination is being undertaken. And then they are allocated a settlement in the villages. All our settlement camps are farming areas, okay? People are given plots of land to farm. Now, I don't know how many Afghanis are coming with the ability to use a handheld hoe and operate in 2 rainy seasons. That is the sort of provisioning we give. People are given tents to first build a temporary shelter, and then the expectation is they will be able to erect houses. You go and chop wood and get mud and wattle. If you're wealthy, you get bricks and mortar and cement. But it's kind of very rudimentary. And I saw women proudly showing off their mud and wattle houses in all of these refugee camps that I went to. And so for my Afghani comrades who are looking forward to coming to Uganda, how many of them can live in an agrarian, live and survive in an agrarian community? And so that brings me to the question of why the Poles failed. The Polish people failed in Nachivale, in Chaka 1, because they're not farmers, right? And that's an important question, because in Uganda, we claim to work around integration, but integration is very much economic related. If I can't feed my children, how do I integrate, right? If I can't make a living and I'm a man, many of the men I interviewed were really emasculated because they had ceased to become providers and they began to rely on the UNHCR provisions that would come. And there was a barter system where men would change the maize and flour given to them once every 3 months with food, with money, and they'd go and drink the money. And then the men failed to provide for their children. So there was a lot of emasculation of manhood and failures of men role models. And many of the people who are thriving were women who have learned already to live on small incomes and budgets. But the third thing I wanted to raise before I shut up is in relation to Muswangali's, Muzukuluwa Muswangali's presentation, was in relation to Uganda's record, right? So when I was watching TV in Iceland, I watched the BBC, and they were really praising Uganda relative to the UK, because the UK, I think, gave a dismal 5,000 allocation, and Uganda has 2,000. And our human rights record as Uganda is terrible. I think that just this week, Yoweri Museveni closed down how many civil society organizations, right? But over and beyond the human rights record that is put in the records is what we have experienced, which is a total replica of what is happening by the Taliban in Afghanistan. One of the reasons people are fleeing and calling for immediate evacuation is because Taliban gunmen are gunning down house to house, raiding homes, abducting people who have been classified as having worked with the colonizers, with the Americans. In Uganda, we have abductions every day, every week, every month. Museveni has not stopped abducting people who don't agree with him in substance and spirit. Those of us who are critical of him face the real possibility of abduction. And so what is America doing to these Afghanis by taking them out of an environment of abduction and replacing them in another environment of abduction that is violent? People disappear. People come back tortured and wounded, without toes, without balls, without their reproductive, generative body parts. And the trauma that's happening to those of us who stay behind their relatives and friends is of a magnitude that cannot be recorded and has not been recorded. So what are Afghanistan refugees coming into Uganda to do? If it is to seek safety and security, there is none for them in Uganda. Because in Uganda, shooting happens every day on the roads. We saw in November how many Ugandans were shot dead, innocent people walking, going about their work. How many Ugandans have been gunned down from their houses, dragged by drones? Total replica of Afghanistan. We may not be wearing, well, I am. We may not be dressed like the Taliban with long beards and everything, but I think that the dictatorship in Uganda can be as brutal, if not more, than the Afghanis, because at least we know why the Afghanistan Taliban people are doing what they're doing. We don't know why Museveni is abducting Ugandans. They just disappear. And they come back saying, I wasn't charged. Okay, I was abducted, tortured, thrown in a detention center that is unmarked, but I left without getting any charge. And so the levels of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment that are happening in Afghanistan are very present in Uganda, and we should not pretend that the so-called refugee record of being the exemplar necessarily means that our government is a democratic society. Refugees can do well in a democratic environment. Uganda is a dictatorship, and our whoever we receive in the country must be protected from the dictator, because the environment is as terrible as it is back home in Afghanistan.
And Stella, I think just before Stella closes that subject, you remember we had the terrible situation where one of a senior government official was indicted for having participated in forcefully returning refugees to a country where they had fled, in total disregard for all the international obligations that requires that refugees must never be returned to places where there is a real threat against their life. It happened, and I think it's those sorts of challenges that really gets you to question, what is really the motivation? What are we looking at here? Because right. if the state cannot guarantee the safety of its own citizens, as we know that thousands of young men, up as we speak today, they still remain unaccounted for, and the crime they have committed is to supposedly to support a different presidential candidate in the recently concluded presidential elections. I think for me, actually, because Ted has hinted on it, for me, I was thinking that when I heard the president speaking about those gross human rights violations, which of course relating to this debate of refugee and asylum seeking in different countries, when I heard the president speak about that, my wish, my humble wish, putting my hand on my chest, I would have expected him to make a sweeping announcement and say that, hey, look, every person who is in a Ugandan jail without due process having been followed should be let free. That's what I would have expected. But I think we are a bit digressing away from the subject. I agree with what Taylor has said. I think respecting the basic human rights of those people who are fleeing a dangerous zone is critically important. But I think it would be highly hypocritical for us to think that we have the best kind of scenario when the plights of our own people what they are, in the current environment.
Of course, and I think you both start a very interesting conversation in this scenario, because I know you're both critical thinkers. You need to interrogate the issue or the idea of Mr. Museveni talking about human rights on Saturday, addressing human rights in Uganda on Saturday, and then on Tuesday, accepting to bring in refugees. Is there a correlation between Mr. Museveni talking about human rights events in Ugandan jails, or pertaining to people who have been arrested or being held by the police and the army on Saturday, and then on Tuesday, they become the first country to pledge or to encourage or to accept bringing in either political or religious refugees. We don't know the category, which category they are, and that is something that we need to interrogate and figure out who are these people who are coming in the country. Are they religious refugees? Are they economic refugees? Just as Dr. Stella intimated, are they? Is Afghanistan unstable? We don't know that yet, right? We know that there's a new order which probably is going to implement Sharia law as they have intimated in many of their videos. I think the Taliban government wants to change the governance from democracy to Sharia law. So, and I think when we talk about women who have been who are facing who might potentially face death, as we have seen in different videos, or other men who support the Western way of governance being killed off right now, because there's a video that I can't even show that shows the so-called Afghan Taliban shooting people who have been working for governments. We don't know how true that video is, but it has been circulating around social media. I do have a couple of I do have 2 videos that I'm going to play, and I want us to delve into those events as they happened. So that's one, and the second one, which is contextualized in the Ugandan situation.
Uganda has an open-door refugee policy. This is a country which is home to over 1.4 million refugees. So when the US approached Uganda to take in that request to take in 2,000 Afghan refugees, Uganda had to accept that because it is a hospitable country, and it has been doing that. It has been hosting refugees from all over the region and other countries in Africa. And another thing is that Uganda has been having that long-term cooperation with the US in terms of professionalization of the army. Uganda has been benefiting a lot from the U.S. when it comes to maternal health, when it comes to supporting agriculture. So this mutual benefit from each other has prompted Uganda to really take up these refugees. What we know is that they are coming in batches like 500, and there is definitely space for them here because we have a number of settlements in Uganda, and specifically with this kind of refugees coming in, they will be, what we know is that they will be hosted in hotels. They will be here for around 3 months as they are being cleared, and what we know, they will be hosted in specific places like hotels where they will be sponsored, and we know that by the time they will spend here, the U.S. will be meeting that expense. So they will definitely have space where to stay as they will be cleared, and Uganda still has more space to accommodate more refugees in the country.
Is Uganda safe to host Afghanistan refugees? Are we able, is Uganda capable of taking care of refugees at this moment? The reason why I showed 2 videos is because I wanted specifically to show people that that plane that says Air Force, was it Air Force One? Is a US plane, right? Which means US is implicated in this conversation. And as you heard in the preceding video, apparently they are going to take care of they are going to foot the bill for whichever hotels these refugees end up in. So apparently Uganda is just going to be a host country. I don't know what your thoughts are on the 2 videos.
I think to understand this challenge properly, you need to look at Afghanistan as a country to understand its contemporary political history, and what has happened there. Afghanistan as a nation was built, I think, on it's a nation of dynasties. They had kings, they had these empires and things of that kind. Tribal empires and arrangements of that kind. But I think fast moving forward, things began kind of really getting out of control from around the late 1970s, I think in 1978 or somewhere around there, when there was this bloodless coup, and then by then the Soviet Union, Russia got involved, and then so many other nations began to be involved in supporting the conflict, from different directions, the Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Britain, the United States, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really where the challenges come from. Of course, in the late 1970s, when there was that bloodless coup that took away one of the governments and introduced the People's Democratic Party or People's Democratic Alliance or something along that range, the scenario that was created was the persecution of political dissidents, and I think this is where the birth of the Taliban start from. The Taliban started off as a student kind of movement, pro-Muslim kind of student movement that was, opposed to the extrajudicial kind of killings, violence against people with different kind of political opinions and so on and so forth. The only problem is that the Taliban, they espouse this kind of extreme Muslim fundamentalism, a militant kind of militancy against its own people. So when you put them on the table against what the Taliban population has been kind of accustomed to, especially in the last 20 years, I mean, it's not very difficult to understand why people are really running away, because the group that is now in charge has a record of being very violent against its own people who don't, believe in the same sorts of values. They are raping women. They are killing anybody whom they consider to be a collaborator with the foreign forces, the occupying forces. It's kind of it's a horrific kind of a scenario. And actually, one of Uganda's respected journalists has posed a very interesting question, and he has questioned that, what is really the role of these occupying forces, in light of the fact that the United States and all the international allies have failed so badly in this whole Afghan situation, because they have been in Afghanistan as an occupying kind of force. The sorts of things that we see for Uganda, in Somalia, and in other areas. So this journalist has been asking a question that, what if the Ugandan military withdrew from Somalia? What would happen? What would happen there? Would we see the same kind of situation that we are seeing in Afghanistan? It's an interesting question to think about, because these sort of things that you cannot force people to do things that they fundamentally don't believe in. The United States went into Afghanistan. They went there with all the force, whatever their ideologies were. But the people, I think they did not engage properly with the entire nation. And I think this is really where the critical issue is. If you really want to bring people on board, create the space to have dialogue. And I think dialogue means that we don't have necessarily to be agreeing with each other. But when you create that space and environment where there can be dialogue, I think it goes a long way to avoid this kind of excesses we are seeing today. So that's one issue on that hand. But I think for me, I strongly believe that obviously there is an element of opportunity, of being opportunistic. You know how people work in Uganda. People always look at the quick money. There's been lots of scandals in the OPM where money that's allocated to refugee projects has disappeared. It's the same kind of issue that we always tend to see. Money coming in, money disappearing. COVID money coming in, COVID money disappearing. Refugee money coming in, education money coming in, money for this and that. And somebody's interest is in building themselves a very nice apartment somewhere with a swimming pool at the expense of the people. So I think for me, when you talk about 2,000 refugees supposedly that are expected to come into the country, and I'm assuming that those who would be put onto those planes and sent to Uganda would properly have been vetted by the United States, because this is America's problem. It's not Uganda's problem. But I think somebody has spotted an opportunity there to make some quick money. Obviously, the country is strained financially, and it's also, unfortunately, it gives Museveni some kind of leeway, because while he's been struggling with these sorts of issues of being hostile to his own people, now he can demonstrate once again to the global world that he's a decent chap, and the Americans are going to fall for it if they have not already fallen for it, and it will be business as usual. So I think it's uncomfortable, and it does appear that lots of people. The problem in Uganda at the moment is that it's very difficult to speak up your mind, because if you speak your mind, you are at a serious risk. I get the sense that people don't really like the idea. I get that feeling that the general population is opposed to the idea, and I think what they have decided is to go down the road of kind of mockery, kind of mocking the whole concept. Because when you hear the talk, in some of the sort of things that you see, people are being excited. Oh, we are going to get some Afghanistan beautiful women and so on and so forth. The whole problem seems to have been so kind of I'm looking for the word, for the lack of word, but ekizibu bakikendezezza nnyo okukifuula nga comedy. Okiraba? It's that trivialization, the trivialization of an issue of such a magnitude. But I think the only recourse that, because Ugandans are not involved, there's no consultation. In ordinary times, this matter would have been put to Parliament, and Parliament would have been the ones, making all these final adjustments and decisions and deciding, on behalf of the people of Uganda, that this is how we are going to deal with these sorts of things. But the people of Uganda are not seen in this conversation. A decision has already been made by the powers to be. The president has made a phone call to another president, and it's got to be taken on its face value. I don't think 2,000 is a huge number, to worry about. I think the United States is in position to allocate enough money to be able to look after its own people. Because I think the people they are telling us are people who have been working with the American forces. And you're looking at interpreters, maybe their families, and people who have been heavily involved with the U.S. kind of military establishment in the occupation army. That was occupying Afghanistan. So I don't know, Henry. We have to watch and see.
It's interesting that you keep saying 2,000 is not a huge number, but the US hasn't taken on the 2,000, even though they are the ones who have been there for 20 years. I'll be playing Mrs. Clinton's video after this submission, but I wonder what Dr. Stella has to say.
Right, I have a lot to say, so you have to cut me off when the time comes, because I have a lot to say in response to Muzukulu wa Muswangali, but also in response to your questions, which I find quite triggering. I think you said, is Uganda safe? And I think when one introduces the question of what the US is doing to us, the real question is about Uganda's sovereignty. Are we a sovereign nation that can say no to a superpower like America? Do we have any balls as a country? Have our men been reduced to castrated people? Because the idea that we have been puppets of the US for such a long time, we're doing the US's fuckery of nations in the name of fighting this bogeyman war against terrorism. And I think that after the Somalis beat the US, I don't know if you've watched that movie. There's a movie, I don't know, Ego Hawk Down or something Hawk Down, which shows the Somalis totally beating, maybe it's fiction, maybe it's based on truth, beating the Americans. I think from that historical moment that is fictionalized in that cheesy movie, that the US learned not to put its people in particularly difficult to determine the outcome wars. And so Uganda has been fighting the proxy war in Somalia, in Chad, in Eritrea, I don't know if we have people in Iraq as well, but
Iraq, Congo.
Okay. And I think for me that following from that puppetry, which we have shown that the US says bend over and we bend, the US says spread your legs and we say how wide, the US says doggy and we bend over. From that caricature of us being puppets to this superpower and doing its dirty trash work, fixing its messes for a fee. Amazon has spent so much money, it's not free, that the question about sovereignty becomes important. If Parliament had sat, like Muzukulu wa Muswangali suggested, in a country that's democratic, Parliament should have made this decision on behalf of the people because they represent us, but also because they have a mandate to check the executive. If Parliament had sat, because Parliament in Uganda has now become a stamp, what is the word? Stamp pad for approving everything the executive says. I'm not sure that with a little money, we wouldn't have come to the same position we are at. And it was just for me to say that once again, Yoweri Museveni has made the whole state and its machinery sort of everything works for his advantage and his gain and his economic gain. And that is why even the question of sovereignty has been reduced, substantially diluted, because those who should safeguard Ugandan interests are very easy to manipulate and buy away. That's the first point I wanted to. So it's 2 points. One is that we are puppets of the US, but even those people we have appointed and who are earning a salary as members of parliament, or even the military council, which should be advising Yoweri Museveni, are very easily to pay for him to get what his outcome that he wants. That's the second thing. The third thing I want to talk about is in relation to US imperialism. If Uganda has vast land that is uncultivated, so has the US. If Uganda has a GDP of XY, the US has times 10 what Uganda has. If Uganda has all, what I'm trying to say is that the resources we have are a miniature of what the US has. Babatwale Texas, babatwale Dallas, babatwale je babatwala, lwaki babateeka waffe. And it is not to encourage a selfishness, but it is to say that indeed it is a US problem. Why should we always be the Siwa after they have poo-pooed, they flush down into Uganda? Okay, a metaphor again that after the US has produced its waste and needs to take care of that waste, Uganda becomes the receptacle, the receiving orifice for all the mistakes of the US. Why? And for me, it is a question. These people don't need processing that cannot happen in Afghanistan. They can be processed in Afghanistan. They can be processed in nearby army bases set up by the US and taken to arid lands in the US or institutions, wherever it is. Okay. But of course, we welcome them in Uganda, as we usually do. I want to talk about one of the more painful issues that surface in the video, but also surface in Muswangali's submission, and also were mentioned slightly by Henry, the idea that we don't know who they are bringing, but perhaps they will prioritize those who are working with the US and the UK and Europe. And for me, this is really sad. It breaks my heart that an outsider scheme of priorities of persecution, priorities of suffering is being deployed in this moment. How can a person say that an interpreter who was working for the US is more at risk of death than me, whose brother's house was gunned down, or whose house was gunned down? There was a raid in my home, and if my son is an interpreter and he's living in my house, I don't qualify for the priority list. He's my son, he's living in my house. When the Taliban identify and locate him to my house, it is my door, it is my sleep, it is my wives and his siblings who are at risk. To choose just one person based on what? That he has been seen with these white people. We don't come as individuals, we come as collectives. When Muswangali goes back home, he has a wife and children and, but in a moment of seeking solace, if he comes to his father's house, the entire network Muswangali carries, the entire network is implicated in terms of persecution. But also, there are people who are persecuted not because they worked with the faces that are known and the names that are known to have been journalists working with CNN and VOA and BBC and God knows what. There are other informers who are informers of the eventual person whose face we see. At what point do they cut them off and say, you're not a priority? Right? The woman who sells coffee, I don't know if they drink coffee or chai or whatever, but the woman who sells whatever to the Taliban man might be at risk as much as not Taliban, but the Afghani interpreter might be at risk as much as the interpreter. And so I have a point about the priority scheme that is being utilized, right? Why isn't it the midwife who helped the secretary of the British embassy Why isn't it that secretary who's, that the midwife who helped the secretary is implicated when it comes to persecution because she's delivering her baby and keeping her healthy, etc., etc. And in terms of working with a jihadist's mind, we don't know what the priorities for persecution and targeting are. And so what I'm saying is persecution from whose eyes? Persecution from the American eyes? Persecution from the Afghani eyes? Who has taken the trouble to know what the Afghani's mind is? And what I'm saying is we haven't studied those from whom we flee enough in order to start saying we shall prioritize X over Y and not A or B. That's my fourth point. The issue that Henry asked about, Stella Nyanzi, human rights on Saturday, on Tuesday, he then makes a declaration. Those of us who know Museveni and have studied him well, he's a very wise and calculating old man. He counted the dollars and the pounds and the Ugandan, shillings, and then he converted them into cows. Okay? The amount of cows he's going to get per refugee for school, for COVID-19, for masks, for food, for hospitalization, for housing, for water, for electricity, the amount of cows he's going to get per service, per refugee, per day, he already knows. And so I think for me that many times when I think about American foreign policy, because I have the privilege of not being diplomatic, I don't need the Americans for anything right now or ever. If they want to take it away because of my truth, so be it. I always wonder about the stupidity of Americans, the American foreign enterprise, who believe in this rhetoric of a benevolent blessing of a provider called Yoweri Museveni. He's manipulated. He wants to rip. He wants to pay back the debts he made from the past election. How can a man who has established his name as a dictator, as a violator of human rights, say, oh, Uganda, what, who is killing Ugandans? Hey. And then on Tuesday, barely a week later, he's talking about receiving refugees. I hope that there are many people who can see through this rhetoric, especially in the American foreign services, if there's such a thing, to say to them that Museveni is manipulating them. If they want to make an economic enterprise and sell Afghani souls as they sold black slaves, okay? America has a history of buying people. Museveni can be the slave master buying these Afghani bodies. And we can declare they're now trading in humans, okay? We're bringing you a few brown Afghanis, some black Afghanis, some colored white Afghanis, and you pay. We'll pay you this amount of money. So it's a trade in human bodies. There is nothing about humanitarian services or evacuation to rescue people. No, it's a deal, okay? I don't know how many guns and weapons will be given to the NRA, UPDF, today it's called UPDF, in exchange for the Afghani bodies that are coming. But let's be clear about it. It is an economic transaction. Stop pretending about international relations or refugee and hospitality and rescuing people from a dangerous hostile situation. This is purely economic. And the last thing I wanted to actually contribute right now is the idea of humor and the comedic turn and Ugandans trivializing the issue. So there's one interpretation that Mitala Muzukuru wa Muswangali has given us, and I think it's important to actually say that Ugandans, sometimes when you cry, I was at a vigil yesterday. It was very sad because one of us in Munich lost a father in Uganda. Actually, the father died in Somali. But at this vigil where we should be mourning and crying and grieving, people were dancing and laughing and cracking jokes. And it is not to say that we are not grieving, but sometimes when an issue is so weighty, such as a person in diaspora failing to go home to bury their own father, we laugh not because it's funny. It doesn't take away the pain. But I think that laughter and comedy have become a weapon we use a lot, those of us who are weak, because we shall not be allowed to engage with the topic. And it is not to say that brown women and the TikTok, all these funny videos, which my sons at 14 are sending me. My sons can engage with the topic from the humorous point. Other Ugandans, like you said, can't speak. Some of us are reckless because everything has been done to us. But I think that the comedic turn is it is important. It signifies silencing and gagging and self-censorship. So we cannot call you out, but we can laugh at you and we shall say it is artistic expression. And I think it's a deadly weapon. Because when Museveni sees those TikTok videos about Afghanis dancing and us marrying them and getting Afghanis children and all of that, he can laugh, but also he gets the point and he won't arrest anyone. Although we know he arrested the Bizontos, right? So we don't even know what he finds criminal and not. And so as I end, I just want to say that Ugandans see these things. Ugandans are talking about these things. What we see in the newspapers may not reflect what we are saying in our houses and in our spaces. And these are some of the things that will allow this bomb to detonate. We are living on a time bomb. For example, if these Afghanis who come are treated far better than the Ugandans, we are waiting for one cause of that bomb to explode. And I think that the refugee situation must be taken in the same way. And maybe as I totally end, just one last point, who says they won't get a poet like Stella Nyanzi, an Afghani woman who observes what is happening and she writes out against the regime? Museveni shouldn't think, or the dictatorship shouldn't think, that the refugees are coming with empty brains. They're coming with shut lips. They're coming without doctrines and principles and ideology. He may be inviting for us the very eyes that will see what our journalists see and the pens that will write for us what cannot be written. That through the eyes of the Afghani suffering, they will write about the suffering they find in Uganda. So he should approach the situation with some more thought, some more caution, because there are no guarantees. It may be the one detonator we're waiting for, and we are coming for him. We will come for him through refugees or through citizens. And the issue of the refugees is our issue, whether the parliaments talk about it or not. It is our issue because he invited us to find all ways of criticizing him, and through the refugees from Afghanistan, we shall still criticize him.
I just want to add on something very, very quickly there. I think
before you respond,
issue.
Let me come back. I want you to contextualize your thoughts. But I think this is the reason why we have the state of the nation, and because we talk about things that people don't want to talk about.
This is the state of the nation. Rifa Mwanga. We are deliberate. We are reasonable. We are uncensored. The state.
Let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen. And that's great. Let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine, you deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI And we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
We're building a relationship that just did not exist. I said in our last trip when you were with me that we had a huge trust deficit, in part because the United States had, to be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now. Everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
Right. All right. Mr. Kolomzongal, you had thoughts. I wanted you to contextualize your thoughts with that video because I don't want us to discuss this issue in isolation of the US. So please.
Absolutely, and I think that actually plays it very well into context, because for me it brings about this question of why Uganda and why not anywhere else, because that's an important question that we are looking at here. If you remember, I think the Americans had the problem of Osama bin Laden, who was a home created problem. I think Osama came from somewhere. He came to work for them. They trained him. They nurtured him. They made him who he was. And then all of a sudden, he came to the realization that these were not his friends. And he started a campaign against them, which ended up in the infamous, 9/11, So I think since then, the Americans are very worried. They are very worried about a repeat of the same problem, and because that is working at the back of their mind, they are trying to export their problem to wherever it can be exported without themselves having to deal with the problem squarely at home. But even then, I think the Americans are opposed to most of these things, because obviously one of the things that has been making the news in this scenario here, Joe Biden, even though there is an agreement that the withdrawal kind of process has not been handled carefully as it should have been handled, the American people seem to be solidly behind him, because every single American agrees that this is no longer our problem, and we have no business in these countries. We should be getting out, and these people should be getting on with their lives. So the question that comes in there is the question of national security of states and nations, because as we said, and Stella just elaborated it quite very clearly, which I entirely agree with. Within the sorts of people that we might be thinking that we are receiving, we might end up importing an entirely different problem. So the vetting process has to be very, very, very robust. We've got to know exactly who is coming in, where are they going to be, what are we going to do with them, for how long are they going to be with us, and then what's the afterwards process, Because without carefully thinking about all those sorts of issues in a holistic kind of approach, then we risk, creating a problem that at the moment is unknown, the scale of which is unknown at the moment. So for me, I think that's one of the small issues that I wanted to interject on that. And I can only hope that the people who are responsible for, policy design and policy arrangements and things of that kind are alert to the challenge, and they can very carefully take these matters into consideration while they finalize, the final piece of a program against which, the Afghanistan people will be arriving in Uganda.
Dr. Stella, I would like you to expound on the paradox of Ugandans fleeing Uganda because of the various challenges that they are facing there as refugees, while Uganda is welcoming refugees from Afghanistan as the safe haven that the US has endorsed. Could you please expound on that paradox?
Right. So I will in a moment, but I want to come back to Hillary Clinton's assertion, quite a strong assertion that we are, or the US is now fighting people it supported, people it made, people it created. Because then the buck falls with the US. Okay. I think that we need to have enough strong voices calling out the US to say you created this. Okay. And at the risk of sounding controversial, I have been called controversial, I make this statement not lightly. Perhaps what we should do is that all the other nations of the world should close their doors to the Afghanis. And if America wants to do something, America should solve this problem. We are making it too easy, too facile, too lazy for the Americans, and they will never learn a lesson, right? So as a mother who is firm, the Bible says, spoil the road. What does the Bible say about the road and the child? We have spoiled the Americans.
The road and spoil the child.
I think spare the road and spoil the child, or something like that.
Yes.
It's in Proverbs. My parents were very Bible-minded. We grew up reading the Bible. But I think that as a mother who was raised by disciplinarians, meaning people who disciplined, perhaps not with the rod, but made sure one understood a lesson. America. Now is not a time to handle the US with gloves or kids' gloves and feel so sad and be trapped into these things that children do. Spoiled children do these things, and as a parent, you run and rescue them. Perhaps what the world should do is to abandon the entire Afghanistan project. Now, it is risky for the citizens of Afghanistan who are facing real persecution, okay? So what do? We refuse to take in any refugee from Afghanistan. And we leave our TVs and radios in that country detailing the very ways in which the persecution of America, it's American persecution. They created the Taliban, right? They created this monster. They should take care of it themselves. Every day they do nothing and think Uganda and other soft landing countries can take on their shit. More Afghani lives are suffering. Okay? So if I were the queen of the world, I would close all the other doors and leave an open route, one-way ticket to America. Perhaps instead of taking Afghani people out of Afghanistan, we should take the Taliban out and let the Afghani people run their own affairs. But I want to also answer a question about where are they going to stay, who is going to do what. And I want to say that as a person who's been in Uganda, we saw Shimoni demonstration becoming a hotel that was supposed to serve choga. Uganda is not lacking facilities to take care of people for a fee. Many of the people who own the hotels that were created in the Chogam times have benefited during the COVID lockdown, the first lockdown, when people were being taken off planes and forced into hotels to be forced to be tested, or it was some sort of forced quarantine where they got no services if they didn't pay. And so we know that we can really reap from facilities. We have them, we created them. They're now huge elephants that are empty. We just need money. But again, like I said, make it as crude and dirty as it is. Chichitu cha business, tulina byoteri byaffe, abanywi b'amata tulina woteeri, 3 months is nothing in the lives of a refugee, because what can be done in 3 months? They're living an entire lifetime, an entire career, an entire, maybe a marriage, an entire family, an entire history and legacy behind. 3 months of processing in Uganda means what? Okay. On the other hand, 3 months of 2,000 people having lunch. So having lunch for 3,000 people, or having a meal, is 6 lunch, breakfast, lunch, supper. Let's not give them tea. This is money, guys. Bed and breakfast for 2,000 people. This is money. This money can build, can open up online classes for all of Uganda, just 1 month, if we really charge the Americans in USD and we spend in Uganda shillings. If we had a system that's trusted to take care of the welfare and public services and public needs of Ugandans, I would say this is beautiful. Have the economic transaction, get the money from the refugees, put it into, I don't know, vaccinations, put it into, I don't know, schools or school teachers. School teachers don't have money. They're now selling things by the roadside. I would say, okay, let's go for it. But who is doing this sort of thinking of saying we can profit from the Americans, give the Afghanis some shelter for some safe space for a while as someone else is processing them, and then utilize that money to pour it in place X, and we shall be accountable? We don't have that. So to answer your last question about Ugandans, paradox, yada yada. So I'll say this again, and I risk sounding like I'm contradicting myself. I think that there is nothing wrong with Uganda opening her doors as a receiving country for refugees, while Uganda's doors are also open for those of us who are oppressed to get out. Okay. I think that the perfect system is that exactly because we are adhering to our constitutional rights of freedom of movement, travel in and out of country, but we are also being hospitable. So what I'm saying is there is no conflict. There's no conflict between Uganda receiving refugees while Uganda is also generating her own refugees.
Right.
I have said that. However, earlier I said, for me, that the problematic is the hypocrisy of thinking that these refugees are coming to a safer place. I think that in the spirit of transparency and hospitality, Uganda should declare we are patriarchs. We are misogynists. We hate contrarian thought. We hate dissidents. We all accept that the president is the king and the queen and the prince, and okay, we shall not criticize him. And if people are aware of the sort of hostile environment they're coming into, let them come into this place. Unless the US is going to say that we're going to create a US embassy, like extensions of the embassy where American democratic values will preside during the time of refuge, we can have that arrangement. Uganda does so many things for money. Unless they can give us that assurance that the Afghanistan refugees who come to Ugandan soil will be treated with the laws and regulations and human rights condition of the US, right? It is highly hypocritical for them to dump these innocent people in a dictatorship that is perhaps much worse than the Taliban regime. And so, yes, we are fleeing. We must flee. When it becomes no longer, that is why we have the world, that some doors are open, some doors are closed. We must flee. However, there is nothing that stops those for whom Uganda may be an alternative to come and experience it for themselves. I know refugees who have come to Uganda, they have been processed, and they've been relocated to third countries. So the principle of how receiving refugees works is some come and they settle as refugees, and they're waiting for the political turmoil in their countries to end. And when it's estimated it will end in 2-3 years' time, they then go back and they become returnees to their sending countries. Some come and they seek asylum, and then they become citizens after 10 years or whatever period. I don't know what the Ugandan one is. However, when some come and they find it's impossible to live in Uganda, they are relocated to third or even fourth countries, right? Where they might go to a third country to get immunized and all that stuff before they go to a fourth country. So being a refugee does not mean it's over and complete. Being an asylum seeker means that it's flux and fluid, and there are lots of possibilities. I just think that Ugandans should carefully read the details and the budget items and the budget lines for the money that comes, and that someone should be looking out for the refugees to ensure that the services we promise them are given to them. Don't trust Ugandans. Don't trust our government. On what grounds? On what basis? The foundation of how Uganda utilizes public funds was spelled out for us by Mitala Muzukulu wa Muswangali. And so that the Afghans should not come thinking that the Americans love them so much. They don't. If they did, they'd take them to New York. Okay. Hotels there are much better. The vaccines are there. And no one should trust the Ugandan government to deliver on its promises, because for the last 35 years, they have failed to deliver to citizens. And I don't think that one can take care of the neighbor's child before taking care of their own. And so the question about refugees living and yet we are receiving is an important but misplaced question. The question should be, actually, it's a good question because it shows that we can come in and out as we please. And on that note, I want to condemn every Ugandan who belittles Ugandans who leave that country. Okay, I think you're envious of us that we have the money and the connections to leave. Muswadde nnyo. Muswadde bwe mungamba Stella Nyanzi, how can you say you fled from Uganda yet it's hostile and then you come back? I have every constitutional right to come back to Uganda. The constitution gives me that. In fact, I won Uganda. I sued Uganda when they stopped me from traveling to Amsterdam, and I won that case, and I'm waiting for my 50 million shillings. But the lesson from that is, let people who migrate in and out do it freely. Freely. If I haven't got your money, let me go. If I say that I'm facing persecution, treat me like an Afghani and offer me some place to go to, or receive me in your country. And when we receive refugees, we should look out for them, because our government is not looking out for them. Even we, the citizens of Uganda, must look out on behalf of the Afghani people we're going to receive, if indeed we receive them, because we are a hospitable country. Let's forget about the dictatorship of Yoweri Museveni. As a people, Ugandans are very welcoming, very receptive, and we take care of strangers and visitors, even freely.
Yeah.
Even without charge. So welcome the Afghans home and look after them, but do it with a lot of skepticism turned to the government and to the US.
Muzukulu wa Muswangali, your thoughts on that?
Very, 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 very interesting observations there from Stella. When I was opening my submissions earlier, I explained, or I hinted on the issues around how Uganda's refugee political history around the reception and management of refugees has been praised globally as a model to be emulated by other nations, and it's a fact that Uganda has been a host country for so many refugees. Our brothers from around the region, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Congo. I remember a time when I was in secondary school, the Congolese influence on Uganda was to such an extent that even the way we dressed, even the kind of music we consumed was, directly linked to the Congolese. And many of us came to fall in love with a country called Congo, even though they had the nasty dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, So Uganda's record in that respect is obviously uncontested. But I think maybe the question that I would ask really is, and if I had a chance to speak to an Afghanistan person, and there is many Afghanistan people living, here in Europe, elsewhere. We've seen some of them. They've been, very, very, robust here on the national televisions, advocating for how they think the process should be best managed, by those people who have created the problem in the first place. But if I had the chance maybe to speak to somebody from Afghanistan, and possibly destined to Uganda, I would possibly ask them what would be their expectations. What do they expect to find? What kind of environment do they expect to find in Uganda? How do they expect to be treated and those kind of things? Because
assuming that they know that they are going to Uganda.
As somebody who's migrated from my home country and now live in a different country, you know, these are some of the things that you carefully think about. You go to a place where you've got to be able to speak the language, the way you're going to be able to reintegrate yourself in the host society. You look at your relations, family. For those of us who have had families abroad, you think about those sorts of things. And finding employment, being able to be productive with yourself, you know. And you know, you're looking at people who are, and as Stella has put it, you know, you're looking at people whose entire livelihood is being uprooted from what they have ordinarily been accustomed to, and they are being thrown into a different kind of challenge, in a different kind of environment, a lifestyle that is very kind of foreign to them in every respect. So people are going to be very nervous. People are going to be very anxious. It's not a very good kind of, you know, experience to be for anybody. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But you know, we talk about this idea that, you know, Ugandan refugees, they are free, they are at liberty to move here and there. The contrast has been made with how in Kenya it's not possible for refugees, or maybe refugees in Kenya don't enjoy the same kind of freedoms like refugees enjoy in Uganda. I'll be honest, I really don't, I cannot speak authoritatively on that because I've not kind of appraised myself properly with that subject. But I would take that with a degree of skepticism, because I think it's different to say things that are very sweet and very, very nice, and then to walk into the practical challenge and you find yourself dealing with an entirely different kind of problem.
Right.
It's you can only proceed on this matter with a degree of caution. That's what I would say.
Yeah. So let us assume that this is an economic transaction for Uganda. If it is indeed an economic transaction, we need to look at how the finances in Uganda are managed, and if the spoils of this transaction are going to be used appropriately. For example, if there are spoils, for example, are we, as the government, going to be able to build, for example, to expand the internet infrastructure to facilitate online education, if that's what we need to go into? But before you do that, Mr. Kasaija, this is what Mr. Kasaija says about the state of the finances in Uganda.
We have reached 51-something%, and the issue of now the question of borrowing, either domestically.
I'm sorry.
I'm very suspicious that. Yeah, you broke a bit. I was saying that this thing has been handled.
You're coming on and off. You're coming on and off. Mitala, you're coming on and off. Do you hear me?
Still there, Henry? Have I lost you?
Yeah, well, I'm also asking the same question. Did we lose you? I think we lost you somewhere. So, do you hear me? Mitala Muzukulwa Muswangali, where have you gone? Okay.
Yeah, are we back together now? We seem to have had a disruption.
Yeah, okay, so we are back together. So,
yeah. I will say
as you wrap up, because I don't think you have enough time.
Yeah,
so
I wish Ugandans the very best as they deal with our anticipated visitors. When they do come, let's treat them well. Let's understand that they are running away from a very dangerous and life-threatening situation. let's be accommodative. Let's take on our role as Ugandans, as we are known to be. If you were following the Olympics, when one of our young men won the Olympic gold medal, the man who gave that brilliant commentary and said, Uganda is the most beautiful, perfect kind of place where you can only think about going to that place. And so I think let's give up these positive vibes, regardless of all the chaos that's going on amidst our circles. But let's keep the positive vibes coming up.
Dr. Stella, in closing, your thoughts.
Right. So as a former refugee child and as a refugee mother, and as a person who's gone through situations that demanded that I fled from my country, I do not take lightly the need for anybody to leave their country. I join those Ugandans who are receptive to people fleeing for their lives on any grounds. I still insist, however, that we must take our government, make it accountable, make the government explain to us these decisions and plans, because we were not involved. We were excluded from the planning, from the preparations. We don't know which of our Milo lands will be dedicated to Afghani people. And so we're very suspicious. And as the opposition, I want to state emphatically that Uganda is a hostile, undemocratic, misogynistic, homophobic country where the government steals from the public purse. And America should remember our record when it is preparing to bring lives, human lives, into our country. Uganda is not the correct environment in which to bring traumatized people. While we are hospitable as a nation, while we welcome refugees, the dictatorship ruling over Uganda sadly makes it an unfortunate environment in which to offer solace and refuge to refugees, perhaps relocate them to another country that is democratic, that is more, that has public good in its interests, because Yoweri Museveni's country, his government, is not going to do anything with refugees apart from exploit them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. And thank you so much for everyone who is following this conversation. Thank you for following us. We ask you to subscribe to the State of the Nation channel at Henry SSALI on YouTube. Of course, we shall continue to bring you tough conversations like this one, where no one wants to engage in these conversations. Again, my name is Henry SSALI for the State of the Nation.
This is the State of the Nation. We are deliberate, we are reasonable, we are uncensored. The State of the Nation with Henry SSALI.